Critical Moves Chapter 4, Ukraine. On May 2nd, Vladimir Putin issued an ultimatum to Ukraine. It was the act of a man who was losing. 4 years after Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border with expectations of a campaign measured in days, the war had consumed the better part of a generation of Russian military capacity. The casualties were catastrophic and deliberately obscured. Independent estimates placed Russian dead and wounded in the hundreds of thousands. The professional army that had existed in February 2022 was gone, replaced by waves of conscripts, undertrained, inadequately equipped, and poorly led. Mothers were burying sons across 11 time zones. The domestic criticism, suppressed but not eliminated, was growing in the spaces the Kremlin couldn't fully control. The economy had absorbed sanctions that were designed to hasten its collapse, but hadn't. That cumulative damage was real and compounding. The military-industrial base was running hot, producing weapons and ammunition at wartime rates, but the strains were visible. Equipment that should have been replaced wasn't. Logistics that should have functioned didn't. The war that was supposed to be over before anyone noticed it had started was now the defining catastrophe of the modern Russian state. And Ukraine was still fighting. The conventional military position in the spring of 2026 was not the collapse Russian planners had anticipated, and not the recovery Ukrainian planners had hoped for. It was a grinding, expensive, inconclusive stalemate that was costing Russia more than it could sustain, and costing Ukraine even more without continued Western support. Western support that was now in question. Into that situation came the events of April and early May. The American nuclear strike on Tehran. Taiwan's handover to the mainland. The American military committed in the Gulf and politically paralyzed at home. NATO's fracturing, the taboo having been broken by the power that had written it. Putin saw a window. He also saw something else, a way out of a war he was not winning, framed as a position of strength rather than an admission of failure. The ultimatum was that framing made operational. Ukraine would enter immediate negotiations on territorial settlement, accepting Russian control of the 4 oblasts annexed in 2022, and the Crimean Peninsula annexed in 2014. In exchange, Russia would cease hostilities. The deadline was 72 hours. The language was diplomatic. The meaning was not. And underneath the diplomatic language, for anyone reading it carefully, was the implicit threat that gave the ultimatum whatever force it had. Russia had nuclear weapons. The United States had just demonstrated that nuclear weapons get used when a nuclear power is frustrated enough. Putin was frustrated enough. The pressure on Kyiv was immediate and came from every direction simultaneously. European governments, watching their economies buckle under the weight of closed shipping lanes and energy shortages, watching the American anchor of the alliance system come loose in real time, calculated that a negotiated settlement in Ukraine was the price of avoiding something worse. Their logic was the same logic that had produced every failed appeasement in history. Give this to avoid something worse. The something worse, in this case, was a Russian nuclear strike on a European capital. The European Union suspended arms exports to Ukraine within 48 hours of the ultimatum. The decision was framed as creating space for diplomacy. It was understood by everyone, including the people who made it, as pressure on Kyiv to accept Russian terms. Volodymyr Zelensky refused. His refusal was not elaborate. It was not accompanied by a press conference laying out the strategic logic or a speech designed for international audiences. It was a single word in Ukrainian broadcast from Kyiv. No. What he understood, and what the governments pressuring him either didn't understand or chose not to, was that the question Russia's ultimatum was actually asking had nothing to do with Ukrainian territory. The question was whether nuclear coercion worked, whether a nuclear arms state could issue a threat credibly enough and produce political capitulation from a non-nuclear one. If the answer was yes, every future crisis would be negotiated in the shadow of that answer. Every border dispute, every territorial claim, every unresolved conflict between a nuclear state and a non-nuclear one. The precedent wasn't about Ukraine. It was about the next 50 years of international relations. Zelensky understood this. He refused anyway. He was still in Kyiv. Russia's response came on May 9th. The date was not accidental. May 9th is Victory Day in Russia, the anniversary of the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, the most significant date in the Russian national calendar. The date Putin had chosen year after year to display military power and evoke the story of Russian strength and sacrifice, whether true or not. On May 9th, 2026, Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukrainian frontline forces in the southeast of the country. The yield was small by nuclear standards. The target was military, not civilian. The strike was, in the language of nuclear planners, the most restrained possible execution of a nuclear threat while still constituting one. It killed thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in seconds. The military consequences were severe. Frontline positions were obliterated. Ukrainian defensive lines in the southeast collapsed. The psychological shock to surviving forces was profound. The political objective of the strike was not achieved. Zelensky was in Kyiv. He was on camera within the hour. He was still the president of Ukraine. He was still refusing. Russia had used a nuclear weapon, and the war continued. The fallout began moving immediately. Prevailing winds from southeast Ukraine ran west and southwest, toward Romania, toward Moldova, toward the borders of countries that had nothing to do with the conflict and no say in the decision that had just irradiated their atmosphere. Radiation monitoring stations began registering elevated readings within hours. Then the physical fallout transformed into a figurative one which would irradiate institutions rather than lands. In Brussels, NATO's Secretary-General convened an emergency session. In Warsaw, the Polish government convened its own. The two meetings would produce very different responses, and Zelensky was still in Kyiv.